Show. I'm Dr. Kasey Holland, the host of our show. The Made to Heal show dives deep into the hidden obstacles that keep people sick, stuck, and searching for answers. From chronic infections and viral reactivations to environmental toxins, burnout, emotional stress, and nervous system dysregulation, we explore the complex roots of illness that conventional medicine often overlooks. Through honest conversations, patient stories, and interviews with leading experts in functional and integrative medicine, you'll learn what it really takes to recover your energy, clarity, and vitality. This isn't another surface level health podcast. It's a journey into the real mechanisms of healing, empowerment, and transformation. Because you weren't made to just struggle, you were made to heal and thrive. Welcome back to the Made to Heal show. Today, I am honored to have Nicole Bell with us. Nicole is the CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics and author of What Lurks in the Woods. She is an experienced executive in the medical device and diagnostics industries in roles ranging from science and engineering to business development and marketing. At Advanced Liquid Logic, a company that sold to Illumina for $96 million, she ran product management and interfaced with top companies across medical diagnostics. At Transcentric Surgical, she served as the vice president of research and development, driving the development of the surgical robot from breadboard design to FDA submission in 3 years and propelling the company's market cap to over $500 million. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree from MIT in materials science and engineering, as well as a master's of science degree in biomedical engineering from Duke University. Her best-selling and award-winning memoir, What Lurks in the Woods, vividly details her family's experience with undiagnosed tick-borne infection. This firsthand knowledge of the devastating impact of misdiagnosed chronic illness fuels her passion to drive a new diagnostic standard of care for the industry. She also served as the primary author of The State of Lyme Disease Research in the United States and regularly collaborates with the Center for Lyme Action to change the political landscape for Lyme disease and related co-infections. First off, thank you for your work because it is so important and you have made so many accomplishments. So thank you for being here.
Oh, I appreciate that. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's very clear that you have a lot of passion behind your work. So first, I just want our listeners to hear, your story, your personal connection to undiagnosed tick-borne illness.
Yeah, so it was really a journey that started with my husband. So he really, the first onset of symptoms were more mood based. He was irritable. He was, frankly, kind of mean and nasty. He became depressed and withdrawn, even though he was a very social, kind of happy individual. And we went to therapy, but nothing ever got better. And then eventually I realized that he was having cognitive issues and he was forgetting basic things. Like he was a brilliant engineer, electrical engineer, computer scientist, and then all of a sudden he couldn't remember the 4-digit code to our house security system. He couldn't remember the time to pick up the kids from daycare. And I was like, what is going on, right? And that was what inspired us to go get tested and to go to the doctor and figure out what was going on. And I thought of Lyme disease at his first appointment because it really just made sense in his case. He was always in the woods, he was a hunter, he had many tick exposures in several endemic areas across the United States. And he tested negative, as a lot of people do. And we were eventually referred to a neurologist where he was given a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease. And that was like a baseball bat in the face, really, to us, to him, the whole family. And we eventually returned to the potential for tick-borne illness about 15 months after that first appointment, at which point I figured out that he not only had Lyme disease, but he also had two common co-infections, specifically Babesia and Bartonella. And but unfortunately, we'd really lost a lot of valuable time. When we first started going to the neurologist, they actually said he was in the late stages of Alzheimer's, right? Which was, again, like that baseball bat, because I was still trying to convince him that something was wrong. And they were telling me he was in the late stages of cognitive decline. So, anyways, his journey didn't end well. He ended up passing away in 2022. And it's kind of set me on this mission to be an advocate and the complexity of these diseases and all the manifestations that they can have, and then also to provide better answers because I kept coming back to, well, what if that at that first appointment we had actually gotten an accurate result? How would our story have changed? And so I can't rewrite that story for Russ, but I can for, the millions of other patients that are out there.
Thank you for sharing that, and I'm really sorry for your loss. That definitely gives you a unique passion for what you're doing. And you're right. I mean, as a provider, when I think about, when somebody presents with symptoms that we need to look at for Lyme, it's kind of at the point where do we even do a Western blot because it's so negative all the time? It doesn't mean anything. And even if I explain that to them, it can almost be like a false sense of security. Like, well, that was negative, so I'm just going to go with that. And then they walk out of your office with continuing decline of symptoms, which is part of why not only having better tests, but also just education and like the advocacy work that you're doing is so important. So tell me a little bit about and our listeners, because can you kind of break down what the goals are with Galaxy Diagnostics and what makes it so different to test directly?
Yeah. So, I mean, you really have to start with why the current tests are broken, right? So, why do you not have that faith in the Western blot and some of the antibody based tests? And the reason is because antibody tests are an immune response to the pathogen, right? So, it's your body actually having an immune response. I can't say it a better way than that to the actual infection. And that's that can be very different. Like you could have a completely different immune response than I do. Somebody who has a lot of comorbidities or other exposures is going to behave some very different from somebody who's kind of healthy or has already been exposed to the pathogen. And so antibody testing is complicated for a lot of reasons. One of the most important ones is that they take a while to develop, right? So antibodies at the early stages of infection, it takes 4 to 6 weeks and often longer for antibodies to peak. And that's the best time to test and to treat, right? Because if, studies have shown that if you wait even 30 days from the tick bite to get a diagnosis, your possibility of developing ongoing chronic symptoms is over doubled, right? So the longer you wait, the longer those pathogens have to spread into your tissues and start kind of making home, the more likely you are to have kind of ongoing issues. So that's number one. Number two is that some people just don't have a strong antibody response. Either naturally their immune system doesn't respond, and this has been shown in humans and in animal models, or it's somebody like my husband who probably had these pathogens on board for over a decade and had just his immune system had been slowly fighting them, kind of like a slow smoldering fire. And so at the end of the day, his immune system was fatigued and it wasn't producing Lyme antibodies, it really wasn't producing any antibodies. His total IgG titers were extremely low. And I realize that now, but I didn't at the time. And then another reason why antibodies are complicated is because that just indicates past exposure. It doesn't indicate current infection, right? I have COVID antibodies, but that doesn't mean I have COVID right now. And so a lot of times patients after treatment, they're still feeling bad. And the question is, do they still have an active infection? Do they still have kind of remnants of the pathogen around that maybe aren't alive but are still causing immune responses? Do they have an undiagnosed co-infection? Do they have immune dysregulation? Like there's a lot of reasons why people can feel badly after treatment. And so the question is well, which bucket are you in? And antibody testing doesn't really help you figure that out. So that's some of the limitations, but so if it's so bad, right, why do we use it? And the reason is that's all we've had available as a tool because direct detection, which is really used across all other infectious disease, again, going back to COVID, if you want to know if you have COVID, you don't get an antibody test, you get an antigen or a PCR test. But in this realm of tick-borne pathogens, those aren't sensitive enough historically because they're known as stealth pathogens and they hide in tissues, they actively evade and suppress the immune system, right? They're really sophisticated pathogens that are difficult to detect. And so, as a result, antibody testing was all that doctors have had. But what Galaxy's really doing is saying, well, you know what? That doesn't really help provide the answers that patients need. So what drew me to the company after my journey with my husband was reading all the research and the innovative ways that the founders had basically said, no, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to figure out how to make direct detection sensitive enough to get the right answers. And there's different ways to do that, which we can talk about. But like for Lyme, we actually use a urine antigen test, which has been shown to be extremely effective at both early stage diagnosis as well as helping to discern, what's going on in that post-treatment paradigm. And then for other co-infections, we use a high sensitivity blood-based test, which gives better results.
Yeah, I really like what you said about antibody testing because, well, I actually use it a lot for a lot of things, for COVID, for EBV, and it can be confusing because of exactly what you're saying is one, does the patient even have, a proper immune response? Is that really what the immune response is about? Is there some type of cross reactivity happening? And then is this something that is just how their body still responds from this past infection, or is it something where, yes, there's an antibody response and then still responding to an infection that's bothering them? And the nuance of that and with clinical experience it gets better, but like for EBV, that window with PCR often is not accurate anymore. So typically with those antibody responses, we're looking at like really high antibody responses. Same with COVID. Like there is some help with it where, hey, if they have like a really low antibody response and they're not symptomatic, then we don't really worry about that. And so I guess is what I'm getting at is in those chronic pictures where we know that somebody has an illness, that's kind of where the antibody testing can be beneficial of like seeing what the immune system is still doing, especially when you've checked that patient's antibodies know they have a normal immunoglobulin level. But when it comes to actually detecting, like that's what we're focusing on is like that detection part. Lyme is so unique, like you talked about. I mean, you in a blood draw, it's very possible that there's just not enough spirochete in the blood to really be tracking that. Like that's not how that bug operates. So that's what with Lyme and that detection of like, is this actually even a problem is so important. And what's really crazy is that it seems like we still have to validate that so much, because it's like we have the research that shows what the spirochete can do, how ineffective it is to just rely on that antibody testing, how often it's falsely negative. We know that they can be in connective tissue in all these places, but we still have to validate that. Like, we still have to say, hey, we need better testing. So I just have
Yeah.
to say that because sometimes when we're talking about this, I just go, why? Why is it even a question? So, because I know, like, patients listening, you're going to want to go to your doctor after this and be like, hey, run this test for me. And unfortunately, your traditional conventional doctor might like this test isn't going to be in their system where they're just like send you to LabCorp. Oh yeah, I'll order it like they do a Western blot. So I just want to make sure that if you're listening and you like want to go get this test that we'll talk about that. But these are some of the reasons. And in medicine, unfortunately, it takes a long time to like change and to catch up. But this type of testing, it's kind of like, when we get new treatments where they're like, well, it's not FDA approved yet, but people are getting great results and everybody's like, I want it now. It's kind of like that type of thing. Like it's not available to, through standard go to urgent care, but that doesn't mean that it's not where we should be or where we're headed. So that's a little bit more kind of with that. So yeah, let's talk about like how to decide if we're doing a blood test versus urine through Galaxy?
Yeah, so you're 100% right, about Borrelia, the spirochete doesn't like to be in the blood, right? And so it's all about with these stealth pathogens. Our head of science talks about Borrelia, and she's like, she did her PhD thesis on this years ago, and she got interested in it because Borrelia breaks all the rules, right? Like everything you think you know about bacteria, Borrelia does it differently. And so it's you have to really keep that in mind when you're designing your tests. Like, what does the microbiology say, and where should you be going looking for these pathogens? And the approach that you take for Borrelia can be very different than the approach that you would take for Babesia and Bartonella and some other of the co-infections. So, for Lyme disease, Lyme Borrelia does not like to be in the blood, and so getting that blood tube, even if you take a larger sample, it may or may not be in there because it hides in tissues. And as I said, it evades the immune system. But one of the things it does do is it sheds these proteins and sugar molecules that are kind of part of its cell wall or its coat. And these proteins get filtered through the kidneys, they collect in the bladder, and they get excreted in the urine. And so, researchers at George Mason, and then also we have a partner at Virginia Tech now at Northwestern, that really showed that you can use urine antigen detection as a very high sensitivity way to determine whether or not the pathogen's on board. And that's the key because I agree with everything. Antibody testing is still a useful tool. It's just not the only tool that we should have available because it only tells part of the story. And the story can be different for different patients. But if you're expressing antigen, that's that's a sign that you have these pathogens on board, and you need to really figure out with your doctor how you're going to address it and do the treatment. And so that's the approach that we use for Lyme disease. And as I said, it's shown the ability to detect at the first onset of symptoms and within days of tick bites in some of the, published and emerging literature that's coming out. For the co-infections, those can be bloodborne. Those are bloodborne. So, like, for example, even within the Borrelia family, there's kind of two different parts of the genus. There's the Lyme Borrelias, which hide in the tissues, and then there's the relapsing fever Borrelias. And relapsing fever Borrelias are even spread by different ticks. That's a soft tick versus a hard tick. And relapsing fever Borrelia can be in the blood, especially when you get those febrile episodes, when you get the fevers. And then Bartonella and Babesia also are in the blood at certain times and cycling in and out in the case of Bartonella, but they're still in really low quantities, right? So you have to have a technique that's sensitive enough to pick it up because if it's not, then even if it's in the tube, you're not going to know, you're not going to get the right result. And so that's really what the research and the publications that our university partners have put out there has shown is how to do those techniques, how to use sample enrichment methodologies to increase the quantity of the pathogen, how to use really super sensitive digital PCR to get better detection results. And those are the kind of tools that we're putting together. And to your earlier point, we're working to make them mainstream. So right now we are a specialty lab, but we're in the process of going through the reimbursement process, going ready to put our technology through the FDA because we really do want to make it the new standard of care and not just accessible to people that have a doctor like yourself that can, really follow the research and follow the latest and greatest, but accessible to everybody. So while we're not there right now, that's coming and we're working on getting there in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, it shouldn't be considered a specialty test, right? Not that it's not of that caliber, but that it should be readily available so that if somebody goes to urgent care and they just had a tick bite, like standard processes for working them up, getting them treatment, even knowing when to test, like you were talking about when you're first bit with the tick, it takes time for antibodies to mount. And so I've had patients that have come in, they were bit by a tick, years ago, and they say, but I was tested. And I go, well, when were you tested? Well, right after with an antibody test. That means nothing.
Right.
So, and that's what's so hard for patients is like it's not their job to say, that's their doctor should know that that isn't valid. And part of it is it's just still used because, well, what else are we going to do? Hopefully most providers will know to at least wait the proper duration and then test, but that happens a lot. And the other thing is that's hard with Lyme is what you're talking about is, you know I think we have Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and we've done so much to advocate for Lyme. But really when I say Lyme, I'm catching myself now and just saying vector-borne disease or tick-borne disease more
Yes.
because Lyme just doesn't cover it all. Like if you have Lyme, I don't know if I've ever seen a patient that only had like one single strand of Lyme or one single Borrelia species. Like there's always multiple species, there's always co-infections involved. I never say never and always in medicine, but like really, I just haven't seen where there's only this one infection or that and no co-infections. And so Borrelia and Bartonella are also like if a tick is carrying Lyme, they're most likely carrying those. It's not always, right? Again, not always, but usually there's at least some other strand of Borrelia. So that's the other thing with, the Western blot and things like that is okay, so supposedly Lyme was negative, but standard testing typically doesn't even consider these other co-infections that can cause just as many symptoms and issues and degenerative diseases as the actual Borrelia species. So what Nicole's talking about is looking at those co-infections too. And what's really cool is that you guys recognize, hey, these bugs act differently and need different ways of testing them. And I think that's where medicine is really headed, like understanding that we need to be more attentive to these things. I know the roundtable with Lyme disease that RFK Jr. had was very validating, I felt. And we actually were talking about this, and this was one of the topics that came up was people were saying, and doctors on the roundtable were saying antibody testing, like not even just for Lyme, but like what we're talking about with COVID, with EBV, all this, like we have to have better tools. So I have super high hopes that this is going to be mainstream. I can't wait until it's like, hey, you can go to urgent care and your doctor can just order this and it's not a big deal. And everybody knows about it. And it's just a common workup, like it is a rapid strep test, it's just standard what you do to take care of people. So I'm really excited to hear that that's where you guys are headed. What? Okay, so we talked about testing for Borrelia. We talked about the urine test. Tell us about other panels that you have and how you guys address Bartonella and yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so we have our direct detection platform for those pathogens. We have what we call the BBB assay. So it's Borrelia, and like I said, generally, if we pick it up, it's a relapsing fever, Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia. And all three of those pathogens we're testing for at the genus level because you made an excellent point where, especially with antibody testing, sometimes they may be testing for a particular strain or species of a pathogen, but if you're only testing for that species, you're going to miss the others. And a perfect example of that is Babesia. So, if you're going to like a LabCorp request, that really the species that they offer are Babesia microti and Babesia duncani, which are the ones that are considered the most prevalent in the United States. But our founder has been doing a lot of research on complex chronically ill patients, and they've actually found through their advanced techniques and then subsequent sequencing higher levels of Babesia urticoliae and Babesia divergens. And if you're only screening for microti, you're going to miss those pathogens. And so until recently, Babesia urticoliae was thought to only be in deer and not really be a human species. And Babesia divergens has been thought to really be a European strain that wouldn't be in the US. But what they're finding is something that's not quite Babesia divergens, but they're calling it divergens like because it's very similar. And so, one of the things that's important about what we do is we test at the genus level, the highest level. So, you're going to pick up all of the different species of the organism. So, for example, if it is in the tube, like a Lyme Borrelia spirochete, we will detect it with our technique. It's just a matter of probability. Is it there? And that's, why we generally recommend our urine test, because the likelihood of that is low, particularly in different stages of the disease. So this blood-based technique, the way we do enrichment methods, so for Bartonella, we actually culture the organism to grow up the quantities to get it in higher levels. And then we use this technique called digital PCR. And the best way I can explain that is, conventional PCR is like trying to find a needle in a haystack, right? You have one tiny little needle in this giant haystack. So it's really hard. If you take one measurement, it's going to be really hard to find that needle. But if you take the haystack and you separate it into 26,000 piles, right? And then you interrogate each one individually, you're going to have them, if you're when you're looking in that smaller pile, you're going to have a lot better chance of finding the needle. And that's essentially what the technology does. It's being used in cell-free DNA applications, but our founders really pioneered and patented the use of the technology in stealth pathogen detection. And that allows us to do these multiplex panels for these low abundant pathogens and get accurate results. So we have that. We also we have great Bartonella serology that's based on the decades of research that Dr. Bryce Schwartz done at NC State. He literally like put Bartonella on the map. And so we have serology because, as I said earlier, and as you mentioned, antibody testing is useful. It just shouldn't be the only tool that providers have available.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, what's really a bummer right now for a lot of patients when we get to the point where it's like, typically I have patients do the Horowitz, or it's often referred to as the MSIDS questionnaire, to say, hey, let's just get a quantitative scale of like, do we need to test for Lyme? Because it helps, because even if I'm thinking, yes, we need something, it really helps them to see on paper, like, oh, I do have a lot of symptoms, and to pursue testing. And so
Yeah.
then when we get to that point where the testing, and then it's like we have to pick like this panel or that panel, what finances are available. And I know for me as a provider, I'm like always giving people like the golden egg, I call it, of if money wasn't a thing, if it wasn't a problem, like this is everything that I would do and give to you. And then now we work with it and figure out what is doable for you, your lifestyle, your financial situation. And it's so hard because a lot of times if we were to really run what I think would be what this patient needs and deserves, to make sure that we are completely thorough of understanding all the pathogens that could be involved with their health picture. I mean, for especially if somebody is not kind of really used to having to pay out of pocket for health expenses, it's extremely overwhelming for patients. And so
Yeah.
having that be mainstream and getting it where your panel is just, this is just what you do. Like I said, like with a rapid strep test, this is just what you do. And taking even that decision fatigue out, like also think about it. Patients are sick. They're trying to make these decisions and they feel awful. They have brain
Yes.
fog and they're just looking at you like what? I need to do this and all
Mhm.
that. So that's also part of why getting this to just be streamlined is important, because patients, when they don't feel good, shouldn't have to be going through and advocating for themselves and then trying to like do the mental gymnastics that Nicole is doing, because she's a trained technician and has been studying this and understands this is when we do this one, this is when we do that one, this is when this is more appropriate. That needs to just be done for patients. And so that's why this is so important. But one question that I get a lot of times from patients, especially now, because everybody is using like Chat GPT and their symptoms, and they'll say, well, what if I do like the Western blot, but I
Mhm.
sauna first, or I take, you know, antibiotics or something that acts as like provocation of the bacteria, does that make it more sensitive? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so provocation is an interesting topic. And the short answer is that there's not any real well-designed studies that have shown that that works. Anecdotally, we do have several providers that are kind of doing provocation methods to increase the detectability. And a lot of those can be pretty innocuous. If I mean, I say innocuous, but there's some very sick patients out there, so it's sometimes harder than it may seem. But if you can tolerate, massage or sauna or exercise or other things, these are infections that, especially Lyme, like to be in tissues. And so if you can do things that kind of get things moving, it is going to help to potentially improve the detectability, at least theoretically. Like I said, the studies just haven't been done to really understand that science. And then other providers are doing more, different types of provocation protocols, like herbals, maybe some herbal therapies to see, or I think at the other end, kind of an antibiotic treatment to see if there's something that it can shake up. So I do think that there's some merit just personally in kind of the more mild forms if the patient can tolerate it, because it will just, like I said, get everything moving and make sure that you're accurately sampling what's in the body. And I hope that we are able to do some kind of more in-depth studies. There's a few providers that we're engaging with where we're kind of collecting data to understand what it looks like and if that improves the detectability.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Actually, when I was in residency, I was at a large clinic in Georgia, and we would, we didn't have a study saying that this worked or whatnot, but is oftentimes is what we would have patients do, is have them sauna first before they were getting an IV therapy or something that was designed to, like ozone or something that was designed to kill pathogen, to in hopes, you know, bring those pathogens out and make the treatment more successful. So we all we had was, our minds and our anecdotal and whatnot, but it does make sense, especially with Borrelia and how it hangs out in connective tissue. But again, to Nicole's point, just because you do that and then you get, a standard Western blot test or whatnot, and it's negative, doesn't mean that you don't, which is what we
Correct.
want to avoid, right? Because I think one thing that we've been saying this entire time that we haven't really just said simply is that, well, you did it. You did very well in the beginning talking about it, but the sooner we catch Lyme, the better.
Yes.
The less problems it can cause, because Lyme disease it's not like the flu or something where, okay, you have a pathogen or whatnot, is and then you clear it and you feel better, is it sticks around and it's going to cause problems in cells, and that can manifest in different areas. For some people, it's more neurological. For some people, we have cardiac issues and autonomic nervous system issues like POTS. So the sooner that we can do that, because a lot of people, I mean, how many people is it that it's never like, oh, I mean, sometimes it's I was bit by a tick, I was treated, and then I'm still sick. But usually it's, I don't know if I was even ever bit by a tick, but I feel awful. And you get tested, and then we're trying to figure out which bug it is because you have so many symptoms, and then we're trying to repair and deal with the bug. So, especially for me as a naturopathic doctor, like prevention is the biggest thing. Like the more that we can prevent from getting to that point, the better. And that starts with early detection. That is
Right.
step one. And so I think that in regards to tick-borne disease, that yes, we need more treatment options as well. Like that's a whole other conversation. But if we
Mm.
say what's more important, like early detection or better treatment, I say those are equally important. And sometimes I think that because of the way that medicine works, we just get really focused on like treatments and don't put as much weight towards that early detection piece, which, and I think is really coming to light right now. And there's a lot of emphasis being put on that, which is awesome. And so that's another reason why this work that you're doing is so important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would add to that, because I agree completely, is, you can't, it's a lot harder to have an effective treatment if you don't know what you're fighting, right? So the treatments that people use for Borrelia and Bartonella and Babesia, they're different, right? Borrelia and Bartonella are different types of pathogens. Babesia is a parasite and it requires a treatment that's more like malaria, not an antibiotic. And so if you don't know what you're fighting, then it's going to be a lot harder to get well. And clinical suspicion is really all providers have had to figure this out. But it's hard because there's so many overlapping symptoms. And we've had, discussions with extremely experienced and extremely brilliant physicians where they come in with an assumption, well, oh, this is Bartonella or oh, this is Babesia. And then we run the direct detection and we find out, well, actually, it's not Bartonella, it's Babesia or vice versa. And so that's the challenge that, we're trying to help solve is giving providers better tools so that you can kind of gear your treatment decisions accordingly.
Yes, absolutely. The overlap in symptoms is crazy, but also, I mean, we have the overlap in symptoms where it's like, okay, all of them can cause a headache, all of them can cause joint pain. And and there are some that are more like, very traditional, like, oh, that's Bartonella, But if you think about people and how complex each of us is, depending on your health history and what other toxins you've been exposed to, or maybe you have a TBI, you could have a presentation that has more rage or irritability and looks more like Bartonella because of other neuroinflammatory processes going on and miss Babesia. So that point is very important because, and it's not to say anything is wrong with experienced providers and how much they've had to rely on clinical experience because that's been our saving grace throughout this past time. But we definitely need to have tools to just be able to actually know for certain what's going on.
Right. And the research that is going on at NC State and other universities is showing situations very similar to my husband, right? The most complex patients have, as you said earlier, multiple pathogens on board, right? And so a lot of times it's not just one or the other, it's an and the question is did one of the pathogens or all of the pathogens get effectively treated? And then after the treatment, did one, is one still hanging around and needing additional therapies? And so, really providing the answers to those questions and giving providers better tools to figure it out is what we're continuing to do every day. And I think we've got great solutions now, and we're not stopping. We're continuing to develop and grow and really push to get the best possible panels and the best possible technology in the hands of people having to make those decisions because it is really hard to do it clinically. Like I have enormous empathy for what you have to do with a lot of the patients because it's difficult to untangle that web.
It is. It is. Well, this has been so informative, and I am incredibly grateful for your work. If there is just one thing you want to leave listeners with to take away or something we haven't even talked about yet, anything that you want to leave, what would that be?
I would say that as when I was a caregiver, right, you have a faith in the test results, right? You think you get this piece of paper that says not detected or negative or whatever it ends up being, and you want to trust that. But and then when you have a doctor that's telling you, well, you don't have Lyme, right? Not everybody has physicians like yourself that are willing to kind of go to that next level. I would encourage people to just keep digging, right? There's a reason for the symptoms. It's hard to push back on a doctor because they're the experts, but you know, we're the experts in us, or we're the experts in our loved ones, and we know when something's wrong. And so keep digging to find those answers. I would also say think beyond ticks, right? A lot of biting vectors. So Bartonella is spread primarily by flea infestations or lice infestations. And a lot of people don't think, oh, well, these symptoms started when I adopted an animal into my home. And so there's a lot of ways that these pathogens can be transmitted. And so you really need to be um, open and think about, well, what changed that maybe caused some of the symptoms to occur?
Yes, those are both very important, especially the fleas and lice. Most patients, when I ask, do you have pets? And inform them that pets and the fleas can carry Bartonella, they have no idea that was even a
Yes.
possibility. It's just, Bartonella get is very, very underdiagnosed and under considered. Like it just kind of we just kind of forget about it. So that's really important. Well, Nicole, where can listeners follow you if they want to learn more about Galaxy? We'll also be sure to put these links in the show notes. And then if a patient wants to get this test and maybe they don't have a doctor that is skilled with Lyme, can you help with navigating that? Or do you guys have a referral system or anything like that? Any resources that we can share here for patients?
Yeah, so the best resource I would say is galaxydx.com, which is our website. So on there, there are resources that are geared not only towards providers, but also patients. And then obviously you can take some of the information as a patient and give it to your provider, because there are so many published studies and research. And generally, I've found doctors, even ones that aren't, kind of in functional medicine or in integrative medicine, if you show up with papers and data, it's something that they will generally take more seriously. And if they don't, then you should probably find another doctor. And so, there's a lot of information on our website. We also do regular webinars. Like, we're really committed to education, both of providers and of patients, because these are complex diseases and we're still learning every day from the research. And so we want to make that information accessible to folks. So we have that. We're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, where people can kind of see as we publish new studies, as we, generate new educational content or other things. That's a great vehicle to follow as things emerge. And then if you're interested in my personal journey, you can find What Lurks in the Woods on Amazon. I like to tell patients sometimes it might not be good for you to read because as I said earlier, my husband's story doesn't end well, right? So there's no happy ending where the person gets well, but it might be good to give to the people around you so they understand the chaos and the devastation that can occur with some of these diseases, because you know, it's really, I based it on my journal entries, so it's really raw and real of the journey that you go through as a caregiver. And as much as I could express my husband's view during his struggle with these pathogens. And so it might help the people around you really understand how difficult it is, and what losing your ability to do things and function can really mean on a family, because it's devastating. I mean, I say these pathogens are thieves, right? They steal identities, they steal lives, and we're working every day to make it so that that doesn't have to be the case.
Absolutely. And for patients as well, if your provider has questions about signing up with Galaxy, it's extremely easy. It takes literally like 2 minutes. So, to Nicole's point, if your provider isn't willing to do that for you, then don't be afraid to say, okay, I'll ask somebody else to do it because they will. And for providers listening, it's a great platform and very easy to use, easy to set up, all of that. Thank you, Nicole, so much for your work and for joining us on the show today. All these links will be in the show notes. And again, just thank you for everything that you're doing.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.